There he is.
Yeah, I had to put with me. I had to push something. Hi, guys.
Good afternoon, Toby. Good afternoon, everyone who's listening. We're going to record this anyway, so if you fall asleep, you can replay it at your leisure. I'm Pete Jenkins. I think I know most of you who are attending, but in case you don't, I run Gamification Plus, and where possible, I try and facilitate some gamification meetups. It's been a little while, but planning to run quite a few online events and test out different technology platforms like the one we're using today and see which ones we like best, and then commit to something. So if you ever have any ideas for people to interview or types of events we can hold online for gamification related stuff, let me know. I'll make something happen. I'm going to actually start by asking Toby to introduce himself.
Okay, yeah, great. Thanks, Pete. I think I founded the Gamifiers meetup group back in whenever it was, 3 or 4 years ago, and I mean, I've been involved in digital businesses pretty much all my career, so that's how I sort of see myself, as a sort of digital entrepreneur. And for me, gamification came onto the scene in around 2011, 2012, with as social media was being used much more for business, and I was kind of on the cusp of that, and then seeing that social games were the kind of the not necessarily the cherry on the top, but also were sometimes the cake itself that was creating engagement. And I wanted to see how that could be applied, not just in the consumer world, but also in the business world. So that really kind of started my journey into this fascinating topic of gamification, and so that's brought me, sort of fast forward 8 years on, I've been doing gamification, not more on and off, have had other projects as well, and which has brought me to today. And the kind of the for me, the what I've been trying to do is to condense everything that I've learned in gamification over the last 7 or 8 years, and to distill it into sort of a simple book, that a body of knowledge that others can use in their own businesses, in their own lives.
Isn't that the dream, to condense it into a simple?
Yeah, it is a bit of the dream, isn't it? Because I think you kind of, there's so much, isn't there? And it's if there's a kind of a slice of it that one can condense and make simple, then that's a good thing. So that's kind of what I've tried to do.
That's very cool. Also, you co-founded GamFed as well, didn't you? The International Gamification Confederation.
It's true.
Well,
yeah.
You like founding things.
I like founding things. I am a bit of a starter. I do get. I like innovation and the beginnings of things. That's kind of where I like to operate.
So, what sort of things have you been gamifying? Let's set the scene a bit before getting into the book.
Yeah. So I suppose the kind of the most recently, the last thing I gamified was something called the Running World Cup, where we created with my brother, we created the first ever mass participation virtual running event. And it's huge. It's got about 350,000 runners across the world, and they what they do is they all run for themselves with their Fitbits or with their Garmins or Apple Watches or whatever it is, track their runs, and then they upload them to the Running World Cup, and they are aggregated by country. So, and it's not the country you're running in, it's the country you run for. So even if you're in Switzerland, you can be running for the UK, or vice versa. So it's been a really kind of exciting event, particularly for us sort of global citizens who tend to be living in all parts of the world at any one particular time. And so that's been a really good sort of gamification experience, sort of looking at how do we create a new type of infinite game around running and the kind of piggybacking on this whole kind of movement towards sort of fitness.
Which is a very popular one at the moment, but I might come back to that.
Yeah.
I think you partly answered this question, but I was going to say, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, so I think there were two things. First of all, I recognised that I had learned something. So I wanted to sort of to condense that. Some of it's kind of a personal thing, isn't it? You just want to kind of get it clear in your own mind, and actually writing a book's a really good way of doing that. But the second one is that in 2011, I created a software platform called Rise, which allows people to create their own scorecards and leaderboards. And I've seen tens of thousands of sort of business managers and individuals, you know, in small companies around the world, just creating their scorecards and creating their little programs. And it's been an awful lot of those don't quite work. And so I wanted to sort of share some of the tips that would hopefully sort of get their thinking sort of straightened out, taking a lot of the things that as gamification professionals we kind of know we know intuitively, or we know because we have read gamification books, that we know what to do and what not to do. But actually quite a lot of business managers, they don't have that, they don't have access to all that gamification thinking. So it was can I kind of condense the useful piece of gamification into a business manager's context, that where they're creating a scorecard. Say, for example, it's a guy running a real estate and he's got four agents. You know, what sort of leaderboard or scorecard should he and could he create?
That sounds like a very worthy thing to do. In fact, the Gamification Gurus leaderboard, which was on that,
yeah,
start my own sort of involvement in actually really doing the social media aspect of gamification well.
Yeah, and the Gamification Gurus leaderboard was really about just trying to encourage promotion of gamification as a sort of a concept, and it's certainly got lots of intention from people who wanted to know who else was out there. Yeah,
I know. I could see from reading the book how your thinking has evolved from those days. So tell us a little bit about the book, Infinite Gamification. So yes. What's it called, apart from that, you know, your subtitle, and who's it for?
Yes. So yeah, motivating your team to the end of time. Well, that's the dream, isn't it, of Infinite Gamification? And the idea is that anybody can create some sort of infinite gamification program for their staff or for their organization or for those they want to influence. And the way that they can do it is by following quite a simple process. Analyze what's out there already, design a program that you think will fit them, and then evolve it over time as to make it more and more useful. And so the book takes you through those three basic steps of how do you create, design, and create a program. And you know, the value of an infinite gamification program is that it's sustainable. It keeps going. It is something that people can continue to use to adopt new behaviors and then to perform well at those. So if we take something like this difference between what's finite gamification and infinite gamification, step back, finite gamification tends to have an epic win, an end level, an objective, a badge that you earn or whatever. So, and it really works really well in the environments where you're trying to learn something new. So I want to, so just a simple course that I might take and I get a certificate at the end. That's very simple gamification, but that sort of learning journey works very well in a finite setting. However, just learning something isn't necessarily enough to you know, at the end of the story. You still need to adopt it and perform and do it in your day job and in your real life. So that it's in those adopting and performing stages that infinite gamification programs start to become useful, because they help you track and see your feedback and then optimize over time.
That's cool. Now, I've read the book. I found it really practical, but it inspired quite a lot of questions from me.
Okay.
So I'm gonna dive into a few specific things that caught my attention in the book. So I've got loads of questions, but I do want to say to everyone who's watching, feel free to add a question in the Q&A, and we'll try and make time to answer those at the end if they're not covered under my copious list of questions. So first thing that caught my attention in the book was you say it all starts with a score. Now, what do you mean by a score, and why is this the key place to start in your opinion?
Yeah, that's right. So most infinite gamification are score-based programs. So if you take a classic something like the English Premier League, which is the gamification, if you like, of football, at the end of each game we have 3 points, depends on the league, 2 or 3 points for a win, 1 for a draw. Now that's the score, and it's from the score that we then get the league. So your position in your league is derived from the score. How well you're doing as a team in this case is derived from the score. So when I say it all starts from the score, it's because the score is the quantifiable the point at which we kind of start to build our gamification mechanics, a program around it. And within a business context, coming back to that, it is quite often when we gamify in business, we're trying to compare apples and oranges. So it might be somebody who's done in a classic sales scorecard, it might be number of phone calls, number of emails, and LinkedIn emails. Now, those are all different metrics. We can't just add them all together. They are apples and oranges. And so how we put those three different metrics into a single score is where the sort of the idea of this single score that's at the heart of an infinite gamification program comes in.
So it's an aggregate score that's key.
Yes, it is. It's the aggregate score, and it's allowing you to bring together multiple elements that are not necessarily the same thing. They could, they don't even have to be numbers that go up. Some could be times, how long it takes you to do things. There's all sorts of stuff, but it all comes back to a score.
That's cool. Now, you talk about the reason why a gamification program exists in the book, and you call that the reason that it exists, the Prime Directive. Well, two things here. One is, did you just get this from Star Trek?
No, I probably subconsciously, so I apologize to the writers of Star Trek. The main reason I use Prime Directive is just that I wanted this to be clear that this is a process that's available to not just businesses. This is any organization. So you could call it business objective, but then that can start to get confusing. So just have it, but also the important thing is having a single main reason for existence, and actually we can. I think another kind of calls from the book is really towards simplicity and starting simple, and so forcing people who are doing in the design process to say what the reason for doing the gamification program is really useful. So that's why I use Prime Directive.
I like that. So merely having the word prime means there's one, whereas you notice with business objectives, companies often have more than one.
Correct.
And it complicates things. Yeah. Have you got an example of a good Prime Directive or an example of a bad one that you've seen?
Yeah. So a good one. The good one was the United Nations program. I did a gamified the UN to UN staff to try and use social media more to promote the work of the UN. So the Prime Directive was to recognise and encourage social media use amongst the United Nations staff. So that's nice and clear, and so we know why we were creating the program. In terms of a bad one, an example of a bad one was one which sort of kind of referenced the program, the project itself, which was to run a competition to get staff to watch brand new brand videos. And the problem with that is that it's not the end objective is not really clear. I mean, why are we running a competition? So it's just sort of using the word, you're just running a competition for the sake of running a competition, and so you kind of lose it. You don't know what success looks like at the end of it.
That sounds like the classic, someone's come to you with an idea for a game that they already have in mind with no real reason for it. I'm with you.
You've had that one lot.
What else? Now, you referenced something I use occasionally, which is the SAPS framework from Gabe Zickerman, or status, access, power, and stuff. And I noticed that you've got cash as a separate category after stuff. So you've expanded on it. Why have you separated that out?
So if you it's a bit like gifting, isn't it? If you give somebody something, then there's an element of choice. I'm choosing to give you, I don't know, a carriage clock or something or a new Apple Watch, and probably a bit more modern, an Apple Watch that you would enjoy having. But I'm the one who's choosing that. So stuff is something that's chosen by me to give to you. Whereas with cash, I'm essentially saying you go and choose exactly what you want. And so the power relationship is slightly different. So it's completely different. So when we're giving out cash, it's very much clear I am giving you this in return for something. It's much more like a work thing, but also I'm giving you all the power over what to buy. And I think it's just important to clarify the difference between that, because because otherwise we can think, oh, I'm giving some of the right stuff, but if they don't even want it, then it's not going to be of any use to them.
Yeah, that's classic. Offering up the wrong rewards is always good fun. Now, in the book, you don't mention many actual company names. I know you've already mentioned the UN here, but who did you enjoy working with most, if you can tell us? Or maybe
sure. So I mean, my biggest experience was working with IBM for a long period. We worked with them to get their to do their inside sales team across the world, and one of the things that was interesting about that was that there were so many different systems that they were pulling data in. And IBM's a massive company, so they have systems coming out of every over their ears. I mean, there's everywhere there's a system, and so they had 12 different systems, and they had then 60 metrics, and they were condensing them into a single score. So that was a very interesting project because there was just lots to do, and it really. For me, it forced a lot of the thinking that has come in that you're finding in the book actually derived from that project. But the one that sticks out the most in terms of interesting results was the power company. They're the UK power networks company. The UK's, we won't go into how the electricity system works in the UK, but there's a company called the UK Power Networks, and what they do is they're kind of responsible for keeping the electricity working. They don't generate it or sell it to you, but they make sure it works. So they have a group of engineers called faults engineers, and they are people who put their lives on the line every day to go and fix it when a tree smashes down an electrical cable or there's a fault in the network. So they're kind of pretty they're tough. These are tough characters, and so we wanted to get them to use the system more, and they also have targets and things. But so we gamified them in terms of how they were doing and how they were scoring against each other and how well they were using the system against multiple metrics, and it was condensed again into a power score.
Yeah.
And the interesting results of it were that of those guys, maybe 20% of them actually liked the gamification. The way it was framed, their management chose how it was framed, but the framing of it attracted 20% of them. And but the most interesting thing was that 100% of them went on to improve one of the key metrics that the management were looking at. And one of the things that stays with me is that the manager said it was for the first time ever he'd seen the time to site, the time from somebody having the electricity pylon going down and somebody getting the faults engineers getting there to fix it below 40 minutes. He said for the first time ever. And even after the program had finished, a year later, that metric had stuck, and the guys were still getting to site on time. Or as he described it, they were putting down their coffee rather than waiting to drink the end of their coffee before leaving the office.
I've got a vision in my mind of like cops throwing the coffee out the window.
Yeah, that's right. It is, exactly. So yeah, but I mean, gamification is great like that, because you suddenly find yourself working with these really interesting scenarios and really interesting places. And I think one of the other things that I think the book hopefully does highlight is that every gamification context is unique. So every project is unique, and that's what makes makes it so interesting. Is that there isn't really a kind of a one size fits all. There literally is not a one size fits all. Every business has a different objective. Every organization and people are different. So the gamification strategy you apply there will be different.
That's cool. I noticed on that last one you mentioned like 20% of them joined in, shall we say. Yeah. In your book, you talk about a player Optin spectrum. Okay, yes. I liked the idea of this a lot. Can you tell us a bit more about this, and maybe also where on the spectrum they are, how that affects the project?
Yes. So this was a good example. So a lot of these workplace ones are mandatory. So they just assume like everyone's got to use it. But that's not necessarily the best way to get buy-in. Only really Optin gets buy-in. So because imagine I say to you, here's a score for you, and then and you all got it, and they're just like, oh, management, this is another way for management to control me. Whereas if I say to you, hey, do you want to get better at your job? If you choose to, we'll give you this extra report that helps you see how well you're using the computer system. And then you're like, oh, okay, I might try that. And suddenly it's on you. You've chosen that tool. So the difference between opt-in and kind of and buy-in and mandatory is is quite a big difference. And what we were finding is actually that there's a spectrum as well in between. So it's not just as black and white as either you're opting in or you're not, or mandatory or not. Actually, you can have granularities of opt-in. So someone could say could be mandatory on getting a score, but they have to opt into the ranking and leaderboard element of it. Or what we were looking at as well is that someone could be could not even see their rank. They wouldn't even know that they were being ranked. They would just see their score. So there's lots of different ways in which you can control it. And the best way is full opt-in. That's the one that gets the most buy-in.
We talk about that, but don't we, a lot in gamification? We
do.
I think following on from that and from your score metric, you also then talk about lead and lag indicators.
Yep.
I particularly like the weight loss example and also some of your metaphors. So tell us a bit more about lead and lag indicators.
Lead and lag, yeah, lead and lag. So, a lag metric is something that happens after the event, and a lead metric is something that happens before you get what you do to get there. So, as an example, if you take something like weight loss, the number of pounds you've lost or gained each week, or kilograms, depending on where you're from, is that is a lag metric, because once it's happened, there's not very much you can do with it. But the lead metrics that go into weight loss, so number of times you do exercise, what food you eat in the day, those are the sort, how much sleep you get, which we now know is important. All of those sorts of things are things that you can control and you can affect. So a good gamification program, yes, of course, it will probably show the lag measures, but actually, if you want to give your players something that they can affect and can change, then show them the lead indicators, because then they'll say, okay, yeah, I can choose what I put in my body. I can choose how much exercise I do.
Gotcha. So, for instance, in sales, it's not closing the sales; it's how many calls you might make. That sort of thing.
Correct.
The lead.
Exactly. In sales, it's exactly the same.
That's cool. You also mentioned counting the fruit, not the leaves. What was that?
Yeah. So this metaphor comes from just a lot of people will look at the wrong metric. I mean, it's as simple as that. And actually, you could look at a tree and say, oh, it's got lots of leaves, but if there's no fruit, and actually what I really want is fruit, then I'm counting the wrong thing. So it's just, I think if in doubt, however, it is better to, so when you're looking at lead and lag, I found, I mean, this is a nuance that each person will find, but I found it's generally better to sort of highlight the fruit, because then at least you don't get trees with lots of leaves. You don't get people doing lots of activities you don't really need.
Right. So it's a good metaphor for handling the fact that whatever you measure affects behavior.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's it.
Okay. Now you talk about positive and negative metrics, and that counting what's good is generally more motivating, which I like the sound of. But my question that sparked in my mind was, do you think managers are more used to defaulting to negative metrics? You know, the people that want to spot issues and then try and solve those.
Yeah.
How do we?
Well, I mean that's a key difference between something that's like a management report and a report that you're trying to encourage people to do something with. I mean, if your management report may well say, okay, that's the number of flaws in that production line or whatever it is, but actually for the people doing the production line, they don't really want to know the number of flaws. They'd like to know how many widgets they've made that day. So it does come back down to who you're trying to encourage with the numbers. So for us who are doing it, we want to know what number to chase. The other side of it, though, is that human beings are conditioned to like higher numbers. It's just how we think. And a lot of this comes from our school conditioning, doesn't it? Well, if you get a higher mark, it's better than a lower mark. So when you're creating your infinite gamification program, structure it that way, because that's the way the human mind is already wired.
Okay, so take advantage of the defaults.
Exactly.
So we've got the concept underlying everything of scores.
Yep.
Then you start talking about score periods. So I'm guessing that's how long you're judging a particular score over. Mm-hmm. And then you talk about resetting scores. And I thought this was quite interesting, because I don't want to lose the score I built. So what did you mean?
Right. So well, there's two things there. So firstly, on score periods. So we're human beings, we're not robots, so we do have inbuilt circadian rhythms, and we have days, weeks, months, years for a reason. And so one of the classic kind of mistakes that I see is people trying to create their gamification programs as 100% real time, and the numbers always changing. That may be vaguely relevant if you're in a Formula One race, but for most business things like a sales scorecard, it's actually irrelevant. You don't want to know how it's changing minute by minute. But what you do need is to create these kind of rhythms of people checking in and seeing how they've done. Oh, how did I do this week? Or how did I do today? Or how did I do this month versus last month? So having a score period sets that kind of rhythm in process for somebody to sort of look at what they're doing and then optimize. So that's kind of the first point around the sort of the score periods. And the resetting scores is just a part of that, really. It's part of that kind of rhythm. My last month's score is different from this month's score, so at the beginning of the month it resets. So that's kind of how I see it, rather than, I mean, there may be some cumulative score in the background, but actually that's less in terms of me improving my performance over time. I just want to see, have I done better this period versus last period? So
it's more about trends in your score if you go by a period in that respect.
Yeah, and it's trying to help people continuously improve. How do I get infinite gamification is really about that continuous improvement. And one of the ways in which we improve is by seeing how we did in the last period and then trying to do better the next time.
That's cool. So just about you, not about the book.
Yeah.
What score period would be most effective for you? What would most motivate you?
Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it? Yeah. So I like infinite. I like weekly is my natural score period personally. I think in terms of weeks, it's just how I'm how I kind of break down my life, and I tend to. And one of the reasons is that I create a weekly routine. I'm just a week. That's how I operate. So I am doing funny enough, I am doing a weight loss on WhatsApp example. We've got a little WhatsApp group we share and that's there's a weekly weigh-in, and actually that sort of periodicity works for me.
Okay, well, I hope that's going well as well.
Yeah, it is. But I don't really losing weight, but I'm enjoying the WhatsApp group.
Okay, that's good. Well, you've got a social element to it, so that's all right.
Yeah, and I'm enjoying the lead indicators. I'm doing all these P with Joe Wicks and stuff and loving it.
Right, conscious of the time, we've got some good questions coming in, but there's a few key ones I want to get through from my list before I deal with the audience. It's such a practical book. There's tons to pull out, but in one small part of it, you describe a few different score methods. So you've got the aggregate score, but you also talk about using sum, the latest score, the max, the min, the average, and you give some really good examples of using each. But my question is, can you use them in combination, or do you have to just focus on one?
No, you definitely can use them in combination. So they give you a way of give you a way. The point is here really that the data that you use for your program will come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. So the way you mash it together into a score means you apply these things. So for example, you might have, in the early example, you might have time to site as well as how many faults have you fixed. So time to site, you want to take the average time that people get to site and mash that into their score for the week.
So if you've got one overall score, you always need to be able to drill down to the things that make up the score so you can get better at them. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
So the score is the first motivator, but there's more to it in order to get better. All right. I think that actually answers my next question. So that was good.
It does a bit. I mean, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, I think the only thing I would just steer people away from is giving too much ability to rank the sub metrics, if you like. That starts to get super confusing and it dilutes the overall this is your score proposition. I think it's fine for individuals to be able to drill down, but don't give them the ability to say, oh, look, John's doing better on metric 1 versus Jane, who's doing better on metric 2. It starts to kind of dilute the kind of the message that you're giving, which is this is what I want you to all focus on.
So that's more letting the individual choose where to work on rather than doing other comparisons.
Correct. Don't get it. Don't let it get confused with, because you're, as an infinite gamifier, you're controlling the comparison as well. You are you're defining the score, but you're also defining how people compare, or whether they compare at all. And you want to keep control of that comparison. Don't give that back to the players to be able to choose the comparison. That's not their job.
Okay. Well, talking about comparisons.
Okay.
There's a lot of gamification that, and you talk quite a lot about infinite gamification for individual, or individual versus time, or individual versus groups, and things like that. Now, in the gamification industry, we see a lot of emphasis on group-based gamification, and we see it as a powerful motivator. I really wanted your book to go deeper into this, so I'm going to ask you for more about that now. What comparisons work best, and particularly around the group side of things.
Yeah, so the group thing, it's fascinating, and again, it's so contextual to the organization. That's the reason the book doesn't go into too much detail. Is it really is. I mean, you take like the IBM example; they had 724 different leaderboards on their program. 724, so all the different slices of the organization, anything you could think about, they sliced it and diced it. The only thing I would say when you're consulting with a client or with your own organization about it is that the kind of the delineations you make, the divisions or the teams or whatever, that your program is going to reinforce those. It's either going to create them or reinforce them. So you just need to be really clear what you're creating. So don't go and create a north-south divide if one doesn't exist already, because you're just going to create a problem. So it's just, you just have to be really, it's really contextual, and use the language of the business that's already been agreed within HR and the business and the organization structure. It's not necessarily a good idea to try and create something new.
That's cool. You kind of led into my next question beautifully there, which is about the pitfalls and unwanted behaviors. You have a nice, really big list in the book, which I think everyone can learn from. But three that really stood out for me that I'm going, yeah, I've got time for three. You talk about score fatigue. What is this, and how can we combat it?
Yes. So we all have, if you've got too many scores coming at you, you're like, oh, I give up. I don't want to have to deal with all these different scores. So the way we combat it, and this is referred to earlier in the book, is when you do in the analysis phase, look at the score context for your players. What other scores do they have that impinging on them and giving them feedback in their life? And so make sure it fits in rather than overlays or counteracts with them, and then you'll avoid that sort of problem of score fatigue. Okay,
that answers that actually. Do you know what? I'm not going to ask the other two bits. I'm going to ask one more of my questions, and I can see some great questions from the audience, so we'll do that. And the last one of mine is, do you see this infinite gamification as more or less useful while we're all remote working? And what about after lockdown or quarantine, whatever we're calling it?
Yeah, so I definitely think it's more useful. So the one of the things that we don't have in the kind of this world of remote working and leading remotely is that sense of visibility of how each other are doing. And a good infinite gamification program can really bring alive a sort of a sense of how your colleagues and your staff are actually kind of what they're up to and how they're performing during a kind of in a remote scenario that you would get ambiently within an office. You might see, oh, look, Pete's done some great sales, or John's doing really well, or Jane's got lots of calls but nothing's happening. You'd see that in an open plan office, but you wouldn't necessarily see that remotely. And gamification, a good gamification program could just bring those sorts of indicators to light.
Cool. So it's a really good way of getting the remote team to feel more like a team again and collaborate.
Absolutely.
All right, that's good to know. I like stuff we can use now. So I'm going to work through some of the questions from our audience. First one is from Manuel Pimenta. Do you think it's possible to have infinite gamification out of the box, or is it indispensable to have a team conducting constant iterations? Great question.
Yeah, so Manuel's saying, so if it's out of the box, i.e. you get it right first time and then you don't need to iterate it, is that's the idea?
Are you saying, is it possible to do that?
Is it possible? Have I ever seen it? All I would say with that is it's possible to have very slow iterations. So I think everything always iterates, but it can take a while. I mean, if you take the game of sport of rugby, which is a game played in many in the Northern Hemisphere, in lots of places, but the the game of rugby's taken 120 years to evolve into the score system it has today, and it's evolved 8 times. It's changed in those. So originally it was, I can't remember exactly, but it was 3 points for a conversion and 1 for a try, and now it's 5 points for a try and 2 for a conversion. So it's flipped over time and has changed, but it's taken a long time to change. So yeah, I don't think there's any, and actually, fun enough, just thinking about it, I mean, Zoopla did a program with Rise where they were scoring the estate agents on how well they were doing on social media, and they launched it, and it's been going for 5 years quite happily, and no one's complained about it. So yes, I think the answer is yes, but I would always expect an iteration to happen at some stage.
Okay, I'm going to dash around these. I really like this question. What happens when the goals or key results of the organization change?
Yeah, then you change your program. Simple as that. It's the program reflects the goals of the organization, nothing else.
Actually, that reminds me of one of the questions I didn't ask you, which was around the fact that you're happy to change metrics throughout a program.
Yes, and I mean, as long as you signpost them, as long as you, depending on the audience, as long as you tell people, right, it's going to change next month, or this is going to be the difference. I think it's fair game. I don't think people should expect it to stay. As long as you frame it that it's not going to stay the same, then people are happy with that. I mean, in Formula One, each season there are slightly new rules that come into play. It's the same idea.
Actually, sometimes it adds to the fun. A little bit of litigation on the top of the sport.
Something to talk about.
Bernardo's got 2 questions, so I'm going to pick one. He says, I love the concept of starting everything with a score. In the end, you can't gamify without data. However, do you have an example of infinite gamification without a score?
Good one, Bernardo. No, is it so straight off? I will have to come back to you on that one. I have to think about that, but there's nothing that I know of off the top of my head. I will come back to that.
It's a tough question for Toby. As the book is about.
Good question. No, that's good. I love gamifiers. They know how to find the good questions. Thanks, Bernardo.
In that case, we'll move on to Sabrina's one. Yeah. How would you use scores within charity organizations if the main business goals are based on qualitative data?
Yeah, so one of the quotes that we use in the book actually is the Einstein quote: not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that counts. I can't.
It's counted. Should count.
I'll quote it properly by the end of it. But yeah, so yes, of course, if there's some things that are qualitative, you can't do it. So it's a question of finding the things that you can, and finding the right way to do it. I mean, in the Power Networks example, we couldn't measure quality of work and we couldn't measure safety of work. So those things just weren't in the program. We said, look, those are most important things, but we're not measuring that. We're just looking at how well you use the computer system to input the metrics around time to site and getting the job done. So yes, there's and we're not saying this is a panacea or a solve all thing. But for some charities, they will have to find the things that this can apply to, but it's not going to apply to everything. Sure.
So the issue there, I think, and I see it a fair amount in gamification, is if you can't find a score for something, it's difficult to gamify that particular behavior.
Yeah, exactly. If there isn't, and if the data's not available, the data's not useful, it becomes too difficult. But the only one thing I personally, from my own experience, there's often proxy behaviors and proxy things that are close. So you don't have to be 100% right in order for it to be useful. In the land of the blind, a one-eyed man is king. The just having something that approximates to where you want to get people to can still be helpful. And you can just ask yourself, is this better than if I had nothing at all? And sometimes the answer is yes.
Yeah, sometimes you can just see a more general trend, can't you?
Yeah.
Another question for Bernardo. This one I feel is quite broad. He says, I know you're not an education expert, but how do you see an infinite gamified approach towards the education system?
Yes, good question. So house points, so the whole kind of Hogwarts, Gryffindor versus Ravenclaw. House points are a classic infinite gamification. They reset every year, and you've split everybody into teams. And I mean, I think they're ripe for evolution. I think I think that the people designing the house point systems tend to be, you know, I mean, educators know gamification instinctively. I mean, they're doing it all the time, every day. But some of the tips in here may point them towards different sorts of metrics that could also go into house points and make it a richer and more useful score for the students. So I think that house points mechanism is good. The other place I've seen people use infinite gamification is around behavior that's around the formal education process. So things like attendance at the lectures, helping each other with work, asking good questions, those sorts of sort of non-core behaviors. Again, infinite gamification can work quite usefully there.
I think you answered that pretty well, considering how broad the question was. So in a second, I'm going to turn off the presentation, and we'll send everyone back to the networking tables. But did I see you've got a copy of the book there? Can you show it to us? And where can we get hold of it?
There it is. You can get hold of it. It's on Amazon, $7.99 in the UK, or you can also get it on Kindle. It feels quite nice, and it's as I've said before, it's intended to be an easy read. It's not, you know, I'm not trying to sort of overload you. It's lots of pointers to different things. It's a useful reference to use in programs. So that's where it's coming from. And my hope is that we can get some more kind of people outside the gamification industry just to sort of pick it up, so that the programs, the briefs that we all get have had a little bit more sort of thought gone into it.
Cool. And if people want to, apart from chatting with you at the table, because I'm sure you'll join us for another 10 minutes or so, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
So the best way to get in touch is via for this group, I mean, just email me, Toby at tobyberesford.com. I think most of you are already on my LinkedIn. If you're not, please add me, or on Facebook. So just get in touch.
Fantastic. I like the fact that we got one more point, which is obviously someone from not in the UK. House points are actually used in education in the UK. Yeah, I had them at both the schools I went to. Worked in one school and not in the other. Interesting.
Yeah, both public and private sector.
Right, so everyone, there's not that many of you, so if you join table 1 or 2 when we go back, then you can have a little chat and ask Toby any extra questions. Thank you very much, Toby. You've been great. You've been a good sport. And let's all have a nice chat.
Thanks, Pete.